My name is Gordon Hart. My date of birth is 9/12/1947. I was born in Elizabeth Hospital in Prairie Grove, Arkansas.
Okay, and this video is for the Prairie Grove Oral History Project, and we just want to be sure that we have your permission for the interview.
You have all my permission to do the interview on the oral history.
Thank you, Gordon. Who were your parents?
My parents were Victor and Ollie Hart. My mother's maiden name was Wetzel. My dad, Victor Hart, was born out on Battlefield Park Road near the Illinois Bridge. Had two brothers, Everett Hart and Doward Hart, and two sisters, Leola Dees and Thelda Flint.
Tell me about your family business.
Actually, I am in trying to tell you about my family business. My dad worked at the Farmer's Hardware after he came back from the war. Farmer's Hardware was owned by Frank West, and he later then went to work for Florence Hill at the Southern Mercantile. And my mother, Ollie, was the janitor at the Methodist Church for a while, part-time, and being a stay-at-home mom and housewife. She passed away whenever I was 13 years old. My dad passed away in 1978.
Did y'all do any farming?
No, I was never a farmer. We always lived here in town.
Okay. What jobs did you work when you were a kid?
Whenever I was a kid, my job, first jobs I guess that I had was delivering the grit paper. I delivered the grit paper all over Prairie Grove on my bicycle. Sold the grit paper for 15 cents, and I kept a nickel out of it. So I had about 75 customers that I delivered the paper half of the route on Friday after school and the other half on Saturday morning. Later in life, whenever I was about a sophomore in high school, or freshman in high school in about the 9th grade, I worked for Ronnie Spencer at Spencer's Body Shop at the corner of Mock and Cleveland Street. Then later I went to work for Elton Skelton and Donnie Skelton at the Crescent Department Store. I worked after school, and on Thursday night we stayed open late on Thursday night and then Saturday.
Tell me about your family routines at home when you were a kid. What kind of chores would you do to help out around the house and stuff?
The early days of my childhood consisted of a garden, a large garden that my dad planted. It was my responsibility to make sure the garden all got plowed, and the weeds pretty much kept out of it. Dad would do some hoeing, but I was responsible for the tilling and keeping up of the garden during the summer months. And of course, we had a pretty good sized lawn, and I had to mow the lawn. We mowed the lawn with an electric lawnmower. After we had done away with the old reel type lawnmower that didn't have a motor, you just pushed it. We had an electric lawnmower. Later, got just a push type Briggs & Stratton lawnmower, and we thought we were big time. Dad, since my mother had passed away when I was 13, Uh, Dad did the laundry before he went to work at the Southern, and then whenever I came home, I had to get the clothes out of the washing machine, hang them on a clothesline. We didn't have a clothes dryer. Hung them on the clothesline, and then whenever he came home, or if they were dry before then, well, I would get the clothes in, fold those up. My dad always liked to wear ironed and starched and ironed clothes, and there was a lady by the name of Stella Norris that did the ironing for him and down the street, and was charging him 10 cents a piece. And I told him that, hey, I could make that, so I started ironing the clothes. And so I did all the ironing for 10 cents a piece for him from that point on.
Tell me about your earliest memories of downtown Prairie Grove.
My early memories of downtown Prairie Grove were pretty early, I guess, being that I lived in town. I lived at 210 West Thurman Street, which was 2 blocks south and 2 blocks west of the main stoplight in downtown Prairie Grove. And my dad worked at the Farmer's Hardware, which was at the corner of Mock and Buchanan on the northwest corner of the stoplight. I was in and out of that store quite frequently. Phyllis Bartholomew Orr was the bookkeeper there. Frank West was the owner. And my dad worked along with Ernie Lossing he actually lived over at Farmington. His daughter, or his son, Johnny Lossing, married Sue Bartholomew Lossing at the time. But then later, as Dad went to work at Southern Mercantile, why Southern was owned by or managed by Florence Hill. Viola Hanna was the secretary, bookkeeper, accountant type person that worked there at the Southern at that time. Bob Heiler was also an employee there. Of course, the store, the Southern Mercantile, had a grocery store, and it was just east of the main Southern Mercantile building, and was accessible from the Mercantile and from the street side also. The next store up was the IGA, and going east, the next store was IGA. It was owned by Guy and Guy Sparks and Donnie Stone. Crandall Miller was the butcher. Donnie Ramsey, who lived out at Illinois Chapel, about 5 years older than me, and my best friend worked there as a delivery boy. There was another fellow by the name of Ronnie Miller that worked there also. I think the next store to the east was probably Jack's Barbershop. And then the store east of that became the hardware store when Frank sold his hardware business to George West. It became the hardware store. Then east of that was the Neil's Dry Goods store, owned by Dude Neil, and I can't remember his wife's name but they had a clothing shop there. And then the next store was the Sterling Drug Store, owned by Vincel Bell and Clarence Davis. They were druggists there. The next store was the Crescent Department Store, originally owned by Guy Sparks, and then later Elton and Donnie and Skelton were there. The next store was the Beverly Theater, where we could go to see movie theater shows for 10 cents on Saturday. I saw early westerns, saw some Elvis Presley early movies there, Teddy Bear and some other movies there. The next business east was originally was Cunningham's Alice Chamber. They lived at Illinois, Little Elm. I'll think of his name in a minute, but Tommy Smith and young Jimmy Smith, not the older Jimmy Smith, but young Jimmy Smith owned the tractor place there. And then on the corner of Neal and Buchanan was a service station. I can't remember the brand name. Across the street to the north on Neal and Buchanan was a Burl Horton's Texaco station. As you came back toward the west, there was a big apartment house there at one time. It's now, that would be where Everett and Whitlock had their law firm, but there was a large house where really my dad and mother and Vincel Bell and Pauline, Larry Bell and Joanne lived in this apartment building. There was an upstairs and a downstairs. The two families lived there. West of there was an eat shop owned by Epperson's. Big guy had a limp or something, I can't remember, either polio or some problem with his leg. Always wore a big white hat. I want to say his name was Herb, but I'm not sure of that. Next to that was the electric company, or the gas company, Arkansas Western Gas Company, that was there. I can't remember the owner's or the manager's name right now. Then Doc Mock had his clinic there along the north side of the street. The next business was a small business. In fact, Irene Dyer had a cafe in there at one time. And my mother worked at that cafe a while. West of that would be a barber shop. Red Pennell had a barber shop. It was later sold to Warren Napier. West of that was a five and dime store. I'm not sure about location there, because there was also a cleaners, dry cleaners along there on the north side. Charles Stills had a dry cleaner shop. and then Dolph Helm had a shoe shop, saddlery shop along that north side. There was a locker plant on the north side, right next to the bank. That locker plant was owned by the Allens. Of course, the Farmers and Merchants Bank then was on the corner until about 1957 or 8, when there was a large fire and it burnt the bank. They rebuilt it along that same period of time. And then, of course, across Mock Street to the west was the hardware store. A small, on the north side, a small shoe shop, dress shop run by Myrtle Ash. Her husband, Tom, was the night watchman for a while. After he passed away and after my mother passed away, my dad had married Myrtle. Then Fiddlers had a Oklahoma Tire and Supply store. And the next building was the Deep Rock Station, where Marshall's had a Deep Rock Station radiator shop. In the corner was a warehouse plumbing shop where the Farmers Hardware had a Joe McCardle that lived down at Cane Hill, did his plumbing work there. On the corner where there is now a storage building for the Ace Hardware, there was a cafe ran by a lady, and I can't can't remember the lady's last name now. Hatchett is her son that had the auto parts store over at Lincoln. Then at one time, the post office was the next building to the west of that. There was a small section of building about where the pawn shop is now. Next to that, there was a furniture store and a feed store in the corner where is now a storage for Ace. If you start back on the south side of Buchanan Street at Mock and Buchanan, Leighton McCoy had a produce and feed store there on the corner. Then the cafe that is now the Beehive was the Beehive then. I don't know what it's called now, but it was the Beehive as a restaurant there. And then there was a Skelly Station west from there, belonged to a fellow by the name of Buckles. Then a house or two, and where the Jim's Razorback Pizza place is, Pep and Bill Campbell's had a service station repair shop in there. That kind of gets you 2 blocks up and down Main Street as I remember it as a kid growing up.
Good. Tell me about attending school at Prairie Grove. What was it like at school when you went there?
Attending school at Prairie Grove was very good. The school that grade school that I went to was at Neal and Park Street, Bush Street, Neal and Bush Street, on the south side, southeast corner of that intersection. I went through first, second, and third grades there. My first grade teacher was Sarah Carl. Mrs. Eula Butler was my second grade teacher. My third grade teacher was Mrs. Adams. On the west side of Bush and Neal Street was our playground, per se, not for the first, second, and third graders, but the fourth, fifth, and sixth graders. We had our baseball field that we played baseball and was able to play along that playground on the west side. The high school building, the old high school building, was still standing at the time. Had big concrete steps and real wide banisters on that. And I went through the fourth, fifth, and sixth grade there. There was a lunchroom back behind that building that all of the school came to the lunchroom. By this time, the newer high school had been built. Kids 7 through 12 were bussed over for lunch at that. Mabel Couch. Mabel Couch was the lunchroom supervisor, I guess you would say. Pete Kurtzinger was another lady that worked in there, and several others, but lunches were excellent, very good. Kids a lot of times nowadays complain about school lunches, but we had very good cooks and very good school lunches all through that. There was my fourth grade teacher was Mrs. Farley. My fifth grade teacher was Mrs. Rogers. There was also a Miss Holmes, who was the one of the teachers and principal there. Mrs. McAdams, I think was her name, that taught there. And one of the grades, because I was born in 1947, that was after the war. There was a lot of kids in my class and prior to, and my class and the class after me, because we were kind of considered war babies. 2 or 3 grades prior to that was pretty small class. Then in the 7th grade, we moved to the new high school building and had 7th, 8th, 9th through 12 all there. Had agricultural, had an agri building there. J.J. Thomas was the agri teacher. There was a home ec building there that they taught home ec to the girls at the time, no boys particularly. And I know nowadays girls and guys both take home ec, but we didn't do that so much. We took agri. We had a large round top gymnasium which burnt. I'm not sure when it burnt. I left here after I graduated out of high school. I think it burnt sometime in the late 60s. They built another gymnasium there. They had built while I was here in school, they had built at the time was the new elementary school, and had a cafeteria, so they moved the lunchroom and the other grade school, the intermediate classes in the grade school out of the old schools on Bush and Neal Street, down to west of the high school complex per se. And there wasn't a street there that was named. Those roads were dirt roads at the time. The baseball and football field was one and the same. It was approximately where the football field is now, and had a fence around it. In my early days, Prairie Grove town had a baseball team that played in that baseball field. On Sundays they would have teams, and there were the Cosbys, Alfred and some of the Cosby boys, and Red Cosby would come in and play, and they were back from minor league teams. I remember some of them coming back from the San Francisco Giants organization where they'd played. So there was some pretty good baseball players. Buck Buchanan was one of the early baseball players. Hugh Remington was one of the earlier baseball players. And I can't remember some of the rest, but we used to always go up and watch the baseball, what we call town baseball games. Our summers as a kid were primarily with Little League Baseball. Little League Baseball, the coaches were pretty good babysitters, and so we would go and practice baseball pretty much every day, the days that we didn't have games. We took the school bus to our games, and we'd play Lincoln and Winslow, Mountainburg, Greenland, all around to the teams. Eddie McClellan was on my baseball team, Roger Geiger, and several other of us were on the Little League teams. But on Wednesday, they would take the baseball team to Lake Weddington swimming. Sometimes we'd go to Fayetteville to the city park and go swimming up there on Wednesday. But we normally would have an activity on Wednesday that the baseball team would be able to go to. And so the coach, J.C. Dill, was one of those coaches. It kind of became to be a pretty good babysitter for moms and dads to bring their kids and dump them out. And, hey, they'll play baseball all day or go swim. It was a lot of fun.
Did your family attend church, and if so, where?
My family attended church. Yes, I attended church all the way through at the Methodist Church here in Prairie Grove, at the corner of Neal and that I think is Park Street, the old Methodist Church. My earliest recollections of the pastor there was Harvey Hazelwood. He also had a service at Viney Grove at the Methodist Church out at Viney Grove. Stanley Dark. Stanley and Bonnie Dark were ministers there. And I can remember Bible schools were a lot of fun. Mr. Dark had lost his arm somewhere, had an artificial arm and hand prosthesis. And I remember them as being in the younger days.
When you were a kid, what would you and your friends do for fun? You've talked a little bit about baseball, but what other stuff would you guys do for fun?
When I was a kid growing up, of course there weren't a lot of automobiles, but we played fox and hounds, what we called fox and hounds, a lot at night. We would meet in downtown Prairie Grove and kind of choose up, and there would be 4 or 5, depending on how many kids showed up. Be 4 or 5 kids, and we would give them a 1-block head start, and then you would basically run through backyards and all over town, trying to stay away from the other people that would try to find you. And there would be 10 or 15 kids trying to find 5. And so people of the town weren't too alarmed whenever you'd run through somebody's backyard and duck under their clothesline, maybe knock some clothes off the lines and stuff. We never did hear a lot of stuff about it, but and then during the daytime, a lot of times you have to remember that baseball was a large portion of our games, we'd say. So we on the north side, behind the telephone company, and the north side of the street was an open field. And we would go to the hardware stores and buy broom handles and a cork, fishing cork, that was about probably 2 inches in diameter, and we played cork ball with that. So you had to hit that ball, and a cork ball that was coming at you, and being that it was light, you could make it do a lot of different things. You could make it rise and float, you could make it curve, left or right, depending on which way you had it. But because of that, and because of being able to play corkball, you didn't have to have gloves. You didn't have to have a lot of extra stuff, but it allowed us to have a very good hand-eye coordination. And so when we actually got to the baseball field and was playing baseball, it allowed us to be pretty good baseball players. I wasn't necessarily a real good baseball player, but Eddie McClellan and some of the other guys became very, very good baseball players. And Eddie went on and signed a major league contract and played some minor league baseball with the St. Louis Cardinals. So,
what would adults do, like your parents and their friends, do for fun way back in the day?
When I was a younger person, my parents had friends of Vincel and Pauline Bell, Russell and Irene Cates, and they would go to each other's houses normally after church, or sometimes during the week, but I don't remember a lot of that. But they would go and play cards, and of course that give us kids an opportunity to run and play hide and seek and kick the can and throw a ball over the house, stuff like that. But activities, as far as most of the activities was geared around whatever the kids would normally do.
What do you remember about the battlefield park? What was it like when you were a kid?
Whenever I was a kid, the battlefield park was a big thing, particularly around Labor Day. We had, it was a clothesline fair. They hung wires between the trees. In fact, Mrs. Irene Dykes was the art instructor, art teacher, and she gave some art classes and stuff in the basement of the old high school building downstairs. And I took some of those art classes early. Whenever I was 13 or 14 years old, 12 or 13 years old, I guess, there was a penny art contest, and I had won a penny art contest with a drawing that I did. One of the business owners that I forgot to mention, Leck and Ruetta Carmen, had a drugstore about where the on the south side where a photograph studio is today. Wanted me to reproduce that. They wanted to buy that painting first, and I said, no, I don't want to sell that. But they wanted me to reproduce that drawing that I did. It was actually a pastel, and so I reproduced that. I'd love to be able to find that old painting somewhere. It is in the Carmen family somewhere, I suspect, but I don't know exactly where. So I'd like to find it somewhere.
What other stories about Prairie Grove can you think of maybe that I haven't thought to ask about?
As always happens whenever you start interviews like this, you try to remember all of the stuff that you used to do that might be interesting to other people. But as usual, I can't remember any right now. About 30, 45 minutes from now, I'll be able to tell you a lot of stories. But right now I can't.
There was an old spring that you used to talk about, and I don't remember the name of it. I'm sure you will. Maybe I think it was the old city water supply. Tell me about it.
There's several springs that are around Prairie Grove. There is, of course, the Mock Spring, which is at the downtown in Mock Park. And that spring supplied the water for all of Prairie Grove until it grew such that they needed more water. At which point they went to Bethel Grove community, and there was a spring out there originally called the Lollar, Lollar, Lollar Spring. Later became the Ruby Springs. That Ruby Spring currently flows water out from under the ground about 8 inches in diameter, 365 days out of the year. That spring, or actually the Bethel Grove Community Building, is on 1 acre of land that was donated to them by my grandfather. So that Ruby Spring comes out from under the corner of that 1 acre of land. They piped that in the late 40s, early 50s, probably late 40s. They piped that, and it's not too far as the crow flies there across my dad's old home place, or my uncle's place, and to Prairie Grove. Built a big water tank and had a water reservoir in downtown. There was a smaller spring out on Viney Grove Road. They now have I can't remember the small housing addition on Viney Grove Road, just right there. There was a big white barn, and they used to call it Mineral Springs. I never did understand why it was Mineral Springs, because really it was right on the bottom side of the barn lot. But supposedly had curing capabilities, and had in the past maybe had thought to be cured some people of some rheumatoid arthritis or something, I don't know. Kettle Springs is another spring out south of Prairie Grove. There is a Cove Creek is a spring quite a bit south. The Cove Creek spring still runs, still supplies water to a lot of people in the southern side of the county who don't have good water. They either work on cisterns or wells that go dry, and the Cove Creek spring still supplies water to a lot of people. The water tower was dismantled at some point in the late 60s, and was going to be cut down and salvaged, and it fell the wrong way and fell across the Crescent department store. Crashed down. There's probably some stories. I was gone from here at the time. There's probably some stories, and I know there are some pictures that I've seen of that calamity whenever it fell down.
If someone asked you, Gordon, to tell me about your hometown of Prairie Grove, what would you tell them?
If someone were to ask me about my hometown of Prairie Grove, I'd crack. It's an emotional thing for some of us, because it's always been good to me.